Okay, thanks very much. And that was a great set of comments from David. These are images I took of David when I started talking about recession risks. My view is the economy has three phases. It has a healthy phase. It has an illness that we call recessions, which comes with unwanted idleness, particularly at the unemployment, but also factories and office buildings, underutilized resources, and it has recovery. So one of the essential features of the forecast is to give you a heads up, particularly with regard to the transition from normal into recession. That's an extremely difficult task, and that's what I'm trying to tackle in front of you today. And you have a document in your book, and you have some slides that represented my opinions last week. But in the intermediate time since then, I've done some rethinking about the model, and I'm offering a different opinion. And this will adequately warn you of the fragility of the economists' opinions about the recession. On the other hand, you need to really worry about the next recession, because that's a period of weak revenue flows, weak cash flows, and declining asset values. So if you arrive at the beginning of that recession heavily in debt, there's a huge problem, because you don't get the cash flow to do the debt service, and you can't sell out the asset because the asset prices are declining. So the right investment advice is early in the expansions. Leverage is a great idea. Borrow and acquire assets. It might be a home or it might be equities. Leverage is great early on. But as the expansion gets older and older, you get closer and closer to the end, then you need to back off that debt and make sure that the debt that remains has a reliable cash flow so you can do the debt service in the recession, and even more so, build up a cash load, because in the midst of that recession, cash is king. Plus, your normal operations, where HR or inventories, those are all things that are better done in advance of the recession rather than waiting for it to show up. So it's a huge issue for individuals managing their portfolios, and for businesses making all kinds of business operation. Investment was another one I could have said. So you need to be aware that no matter what I say today, the recession risk is elevating. You need to start to prepare for that, both at a personal level and at a business level, because it's not that far in the future. So I guess I'm going to move on here. So most of the discussion of recession risk has to do with growing older, which I find personally offensive. But let's take a look at how old this expansion is. So this is a slide that the vertical line on the right indicates a cycle peak, and we're going to put a bunch of expansions on here. That's the expansion that ended in 1948 Q4, and this is GDP, so you can see it growing up to the peak, and to the right is recession when GDP is declining. And if you look down to the bottom, you can see that expansion lasted about 7 quarters. So the horizontal axis tells you how old these things were when they died. So that was 48 Q4, that's 53 Q2, 57 Q3. These are pretty short-lived. That's the Kennedy-Johnson expansion that lived to be 35 quarters. That's a shorter-lived one, a shorter-lived one. There's a relatively long one, and then that's the Bush-Clinton in the 1990s, the oldest expansion on record. That's the one that we had recently, and here we are now. So you look at that and say, oh my God, this is almost the oldest. Another couple quarters, it'll be the oldest. Must be death is near. Well, you can think of it in terms of age, but it's been a very slow growing period. We've got that 3% rate here in the middle. It's been growing pretty slow. So if you measure in terms of accumulated GDP, it's only 20% higher than it was at the beginning. And if that's your measure, we're not anywhere near a death of this recession. So let's think about, for people, what the story is as a function of age. This is the death rates for the US overall. The horizontal axis is age groups. So under 1 year, 1 to 4, 5 to 14, a far end is 85 and above. And this, what you see in front of you is called a hazard rate, the probability of death as a function of age. And it is elevating for humans, for sure. The question is whether that's true for expansions. So let's look at the expansion data. Oh, California, by the way, is slightly better than the US overall. So be happy that you're in California with the hazard rates are just a little bit less. Well, what about for the expansions? The problem is there's two econometric problems. One is there are really only 11 expansions since World War II. So you really only have 11 data points. And secondly, there's a huge surfeit of variables that you could use to try to predict whether the recession is coming. And the two of those things add up: fragility. Fragility. It's very hard to make a sturdy, credible model that is totally reliable. But anyway, we had 11 expansions starting since World War II. Then 2 of them died in the first 30 months. So the death rate is 18% for those in that age group. Then 9 lived until at least 30 because we lost 2, and of those 9, 4 perished in the period from 30 to 60. So it's 18, 44, 20, and then 75 for the oldest ones. Meaning 3 out of 4. We still have one ongoing, but 4 of them arrived at the relatively old age of 90 months, and only one of them, that's us, has survived so far. So the data looks like that, not unlike the image that you saw for human beings, with especially rising risk as the expansion gets older. But there's only a few observations in each one of these cases. So put an error band around each of those averages, and the error bands are enormous, so large that you could draw a straight line across here, meaning that the hazard rate was totally constant. There was no real evidence that age was having an impact on the expansion. So I'm alerting you to the problems here. Also, fear does not prevent death, it prevents life. So let's feel happy about the additional quarters that are left in this expansion. But the original estimate for 2019 Q1 GDP was 3.2. It's been reduced to 3.1. And there was a huge partying on Wall Street and Main Street saying, oh, that ended the recession risk. William was partying, and David was annoyed by that partying. So that's my question. I'm going to do a deep dive into that data set to ask, what does that mean about the risk of recession going forward? And if my answer is it doesn't look that good when you look at the components of GDP, similar to what David was saying. But in addition to that, there's that very reliable indicator of recession, which is a flat or inverted yield curve, which we've experienced as well. Those two things make me think that now is not the time to party. Now is the time to worry about when this next recession is actually going to occur. So these are the contributions to GDP. This is the sort of thing you're going to make use of in a minute. This is a 2019 Q1 initial release. These are the consumption items: durables, which is automobiles especially, non-durables and services; the investment, which are structures, equipment, intellectual property, residents; inventories. You can see heavy in that era was inventories, which is what David said, unusual buildup in inventories contribution. There's exports and imports, and then government, which is defense, non-defense, and state and local. So I'm going to use all that data to try to make an assessment whether that structure is symptomatic of good news or symptomatic of bad news. So how is this going to work? The first thing is we got to throw away the data that are not relevant. And what I've done here is I've computed the average contributions, those 12 items, for each of the expansions that we had since World War II, and then created a correlation matrix between those vectors of length 12. This is the correlation matrix, and then I sorted it to put the high correlations together. And it's color-coded, so you can see that big a box of similar expansions. That's where we are now. So I'm going to throw away the 1947 Q1, 1950 Q1, and 1980 Q1 when I do my data analysis, because the basic structure of those expansions is different from the one we're in now. For example, the 1950 had a big run-up in Department of Defense expenditure during the Korean War. We're not in that kind of expansion now. And we're not going to have a Department of Defense-driven economic downturn. So that's one step, is make sure we use the relevant historical data, not the whole data set. Pick out something that's relevant. And then this is what the contributions were That's consumption, that's investment, exports and imports, and government for those 9 similar expansions. So then I pose the question, how does this change over time? This is interesting. So consumer durables are getting less, contributing less and less to the economy over time. Consumer non-durables as well. One thing that's really interesting, structures have sort of disappeared. Offices and factories don't make much of a contribution anymore to GDP growth. But what does is intellectual property. So there you see a symptom of a transition from industrial to a post-industrial world in which it isn't factories anymore that are driving the economy, it's intellectual property that's a driver. And the other thing is that's very apparent is a globalization with more export and a whole lot more negative imports. So you see the basic 2 transitions that the economy is experiencing in those changes. And then in addition, there's been a big decline in federal non-defense. So you think the federal government is on your backs, but actually it's getting smaller and smaller in terms of its spending on bureaucracy. So how is this expansion different? It has hardly any residential spending. David kind of mentioned that before. And the other thing is state and local has been a negative drag. I take that as a symptom of so much money being absorbed in pension and health care and not enough left for the typical spending that state and local does. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the last 4 quarters in these expansions and ask how these components were different before that period of time. And then make a statistical measure of whether they're statistically different. So big red means, dark red means that it's a significant on a negative side. Dark blue means significant on a positive side. So that thing that I've circled, that's residential investment. It says it gives you a 3-quarter warning of the oncoming recession because in quarter -3, quarter -2, and quarter -1, residential spending is weak compared to the way it was historically. A very important finding. Another one is durables over here gives you a clear 2-quarter warning of an oncoming recession. So if you see houses get weak and then automobiles get weak, that should be warning you that this is not looking good. The other thing that I found kind of surprising here is intellectual property plays a role also, apparently, as a warning sign. That I didn't really think was there. But the statistical analysis suggests that that could be a variable. So then another way of looking at is look at the average swings of the last 4 quarters. That's on the left, -4, -3, -2, -1. This is how they compare with the previous expansion. And you look, and so we said durables is weak, residences are weak. You see that in that display. And then you look at where we are in 29 Q1, and the shape looks pretty similar to the bad shape. This is the shape that precedes, on the left, has preceded the recessions historically, and that's the shape of 2019 Q1. And to me, that's raising issues, alarms about whether that was really a good data release or not. So, so moving forward, I do the econometrics. The dependent variable is a binary variable equal to value 1 in the last 4 quarters, equal to value 0 otherwise. We're looking at only expansions, not the recessions. And a bunch of variables that measure the Wall Street contribution, a bunch of variables that measure those are the Main Street contributions, the components of GDP. This is Wall Street with the slope of the yield curve and the BAA premium over the 10-year. And then down to the bottom, I have this new variable I added that's different from what you had before. One of my friends, Manfred Kyle, suggested we should have not just the expansion age, but the age squared, which changes things dramatically. I substituted in place this sort of what's called a spline function, which is linear over a certain level and then another linear slope. So you can see that begins with a declining negative, just like humans. You're going to die more likely in the first few quarters than in the 10 or 11, but then the risks go up as you get older. So you translate that, and we don't need to know all the details. You can look at those numbers. The amazing thing is this translates into almost 100% probability of recession in the next year, which is a total change from what I had before. And this is not driven by the aging effect. This is driven by the inverted yield curve. You combine that inverted yield curve with, in addition, the shape of the contribution to GDP, it comes out alarming, an alarming number. Almost a certainty over the next 4 quarters. So that means from 2019 Q2 until 2020 Q1. That's the 4 quarters. The risk is extremely high according to this model. And then we can do the same thing for quarters 5, 6, 7, 8. We're trying to get a 2-year alarm by looking at what the quarters -5, 6, and 7, 8 were like. And it's harder here. Maybe you get a little bit of alarm from residences, so it's suggesting that the GDP data isn't going to be particularly useful for making a longer-term forecast. So we can look at the details. So here's again, I need to tell you something, which is that there's a huge overfitting problem. There's many more variables you could include. So the first column, 2 columns, give you a relatively complete model. Then I do what's called stepwise regression, in which I eliminate the ones that are statistically insignificant, retaining anything with a t-value or a z-value here bigger than 1. And then one more step is to make sure the statistical significance is even greater, as a way of trying to control the overfitting problem. It's not necessarily what I would recommend, but it's the easiest thing to do. So you use this model. And by the way, the age down here at the bottom is it comes statistically significant in all of these, as if age was a material consideration for forecasting the recession 2 years ahead. So then, to jump ahead, it's not 100%, but it's nearly that. And that's, again, driven mostly by the Wall Street phenomenon, inverted yield curve. So the data is saying, boy, you really got to worry about that inverted yield curve, but the economist knows that you turn numbers into knowledge by telling stories. So I got to tell a story why the inverted yield curve has historically preceded recessions and whether the circumstances today are similar to what happened historically. My view is, and there are many bankers here in the audience, is that bank operations change fundamentally when you shift from a steeply sloped yield curve to a flat yield curve, because a steeply sloped yield curve means that banks are taking deposits at low rates of interest and making loans at high rates of interest, and they make an intermediation profit for every loan they issue. So they might get some defaults and delinquencies on some of the loans, but they're making so much in the way of intermediation profits that that risk isn't material. But when you have a flat yield curve, all of a sudden the banks are thinking risk is the most important thing. This is going to kill off my business unless I control the riskiness, which means the lending standards elevate. So my view is the Fed operates to affect housing and automobiles, not because of the level of interest rate, but because they change lending standards dramatically when that yield curve flattens. So now the question is the U.S. economy in a fragile state the way it was back in 2004, 5, and 6, where there's a huge amount of home building occurring, and you dip so far into the barrel of borrowers that there was hardly anybody creditworthy left? I would say no. I don't see us as, we're not in a fragile state with regard to housing. Automobiles a little bit more so, but it just adds up to saying that although the historical data issues a huge alarm, and I've made this mistake before and I was wrong, this time could be different, meaning that the recession is not so likely to occur. Oh, that's David listening to what I just said. And then I also have in the data I talked about trying to predict the number of years left, number of quarters left. And this declines after you've been about 15 quarters of age. Then the number of quarters that you have left is not that great. The forecast, if you include the age, is 5.5 quarters, as if to say the recession's expansion is likely to last another year, but not the second year. So failure to prepare is preparing to fail. If I were you, I'd be thinking about my personal portfolio and thinking about the equity risk that comes during these economic downturns, and back off the equity investment, maybe moving more toward cash. And then businesses too need to worry about the recession. And cash is king. So build up that pile of cash and be able to buy things cheap at that time. Thank you very much.